We'll start out with Private Michael Himmelsbach. He's a Medal of Honor recipient. Michael Himmelsbach was born in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania in 1849. We must assume that this is his real name and the correct name of birth. The official records we're unable to locate at this time, so we'll go on with what we have. At the time of his first enlistment in February 1870, he swears he was 21 years old. He's described as being 5 foot 6.5 inches tall, with black eyes and black hair and a dark complexion. His occupation is listed as a painter. He was assigned to Company C, 2nd of the United States Army Cavalry Regiment. When Private Himmelsbach joined the Army in 1870, there was no such thing as basic training. He was sent to his unit, which was on duty in Nebraska at that time. There he would learn his duties by imitating the older soldiers of his company. Often weapons and combat training occurred simultaneously. An older Army soldier had to learn quickly or die. With less than 3 months of service experience, Private Himmelsbach was selected to accompany Sergeant Patrick Leonard and 3 other soldiers on a search for stray horses. They left Camp Bingham, located at the Little Blue River on southeast Nebraska, on May 15, 1870. While conducting their search, they were suddenly surrounded and fired upon by a party of 50 Indians. Private Hubbard and 2 horses were wounded at the first fire. The sergeant dismounted his party, giving his horse to be held by the wounded soldier. The Indians immediately charged and were repulsed, with 1 killed and believed 3 were wounded. Sergeant Leonard then killed his 2 wounded horses and formed a breastwork of them. No sooner was this done than the Indians again charged. We were again repulsed and retired with 2 empty saddles, besides 4 Indians being wounded. Within half an hour they returned for their dead and wounded, and for 2 hours kept up a series of fiends and attacks and aimless shooting at the soldiers. Failing to accomplish anything, they retired. The sergeant then withdrew his party, having all his horses killed. Also under his care were a settler family of 2 women and 1 child, and started for a lower settlement. Having gone about a mile, he was again surrounded by Indians, who, upon appearance of the party of surveyors, fled without renewing the attack. The sergeant and his party reached Captain Spaulding's camp between 10 and 11 o'clock that night. Captain Spaulding commanded Sergeant Leonard and Private George W. Thompson, Heath Canfield, Thomas Hubbard, and Michael Himmelsbach, all of Company C, 2nd Cavalry, to the notice of the command, General Brigade General George Ruggles, District Adjutant General, Department of Platte, Omaha, Nebraska. This commendation was passed up the chain of command, eventually reached the Secretary of War, William Belknap. He ordered that these 5 men receive the Medal of Honor. Private Himmelsbach medal was issued to him on June 22, 1870. Upon expiration of his enlistment in 1875, he re-enlisted on March 13th. He was assigned to Company K, 2nd Cavalry. This tour of duty brought Private Himmelsbach to Montana in 1876. Companies A, B, I, K, and E formed part of the Brigade George Crook's Bighorn Expedition on March 1st, 1876 to March 26, 1876. They participated in Colonel Joseph Reynolds' attack on Cheyenne Village on the Powder River southeast of Montana. In October 1878, Company K and Private Himmelsbach joined the garrison at Fort Ellis, Montana Territory. This fort was located 3 miles east of the town of Bozeman, Montana Territory. Here Private Himmelsbach would re-enlist for a 2nd time on March 12, 1880, at the age of 31. He probably never would have guessed that he did not live to finish this re-enlistment. Michael Himmelsbach appeared to be one of these soldiers that the Frontier Army referred to as professional privates, men apparently content to be put up with the low pay, often poor housing, intensely being routine, non-nourishing food, and without any desire of promotion. Content after 30 years to draw a municipal pension, Michael would never draw that pension. He drew an extra $2 a month because of the Medal of Honor. In other words, this man re-enlisted so he could hold $2 more in his pocket. However, he dies on June 3rd, 1881 at Fort Ellis of unknown causes. It has been this man's fate to lie under two constantly misspelled names. He was buried at Fort Ellis as Michael Himmelsbach. Then, after the abandonment of Fort Ellis in 1886, 37 unclaimed bodies were moved to the Fort Missoula Post Cemetery. This was authorized on January 28, 1887. When they are actually reinterred, we have been able to determine. Thus, he was buried here as Himmelsbach, as you see spelled on the stone. When the new stones for the Medal of Honor recipients were erected at the Fort Missoula Cemetery prior to Memorial Day 2006, the incorrect spelling reads Himmelsbach, Himmelsbach. Rest in peace, Private Himmelsbach, Medal of Honor recipient. Okay, our second Medal of Honor recipient is Corporal Harry Garland. This gentleman has a very interesting past. Because of the loss of this soldier's records, we have chosen to focus on the last few years of his life. What we little know of his early career as a soldier boils down to this. He was born in Boston, Massachusetts. His headstone at Fort Missoula Post Cemetery gives the year 1844. The 1880 Gallatin County Census, Fort Ellis, gives his age as 42. This works out to be a birth year of 1838. We have no description of the man, but the United States Cavalry preferred men of about 5 foot 6 inches in height, slim, wiry frame, and about 140 pounds or less. The starting point of this discussion with this man will be in 1877. This is a memorial year after a number of reasons. One reason that he and all the other enlisted men and officers are not being paid for their service to their country. For political reasons, Congress refused to pass the annual Army Appropriation Bill for 1877. Enlisted men still received their rations and quarters, but the officers had to borrow money to pay for their subsistence. Another reason 1877 is important is a year of intense campaigns against the Indian tribes. Stung by the defeat of Brevet Major General George A. Custer at the Battle of the Little Bighorn the previous summer, the Army was active in attempts to subdue the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors roaming Montana Territory east of the Continental Divide. This effort was disrupted by the outbreak of the Nez Perce Wars west of the Continental Divide. Both of these campaigns will have an effect on the life of Corporal Harry Garland. When Corporal Garland and Company L of the 2nd United States Army Cavalry Unit were transferred to Fort Ellis, Montana Territory, they thought they were going to be a bit of a temporary duty. They arrived at Fort Ellis on July 1st, 1869, little imagining the Montana Territory would be their home for the next 14 to 15 years. Cavalry regiments consist of 12 companies. These companies are divided into 3 battalions of 4 companies each. Companies F, G, H, and L, by virtue of their long stay here, would be nicknamed the Montana Battalion. They would engage in many skirmishes with the various Indian tribes. A partial list of these encounters include the Blackfeet at Marias River in 1870, Sioux Pryor Creek, 1872, Sioux Cheyenne at the Little Bighorn. That luck smiled and Custer refused to take them with him when he rode to destruction. In other words, if 2nd Cavalry had gone with George Custer as they were originally planned, they would have probably lost some of their people too. Okay, and then of course their final focus is on Corporal Harry Garland is a Company L in 1877. Their fate is in the hands of Colonel Nelson Miles. He is actively in the field trying to subdue and capture the bands of Sioux and Cheyenne who are roaming eastern Montana after their victory at the Little Bighorn. Since the 2nd Cavalry Unit at Fort Ellis is the only cavalry forces at this time in Montana Territory, they are sent to wherever they are needed. Colonel Miles' scouts, operating out of what will become Fort Kehoe near present-day Miles City, have located Chief Lame Deer's band of Sioux, and the 2nd Cavalry companies joined some mounted and dismounted infantry. They followed the Indian Trail to within striking by making a night march. On May 7th, 1877, they attacked the camp at daylight. A detachment ran off the Indian pony herd while the main force attacked the main camp. 2 days and nights were spent clearing the surrounding territory and timber of warriors who were firing on the soldiers and taking prisoners and destroying the village. For action which cannot find detailed report, Corporal Harry Garland was cited for gallantry in action by his superiors. He did not receive a Medal of Honor for his commendation, but it would be a factor in his favor later on. In addition to the Battle of the Little Muddy Creek against the Sioux, Corporal Garland of Company L would soon see service against the Nez Perce. About the 1st of August, Company L received orders to join General O.O. Howard in his pursuit. The 2nd Cavalry joined Howard's command on August 15th, about 6 days after the Big Hole Battle. The trail headed south through the Horse Prairie, Montana, down to Idaho Territory to Camas Meadows, where the Army set up a camp that night of August 19th. The Nez Perce, camping further to the east, slipped towards the Army camp to run off the horses and mules and then attacked the Army at about 4 a.m. The Indians failed to get all the horses, and the cavalry took off to recapture the herd. The Indians commenced a skirmish in strong positions for Company L under Captain Randolph Norwood, dismounted behind a low ridge and opened fire. Company L was soon surrounded and was under fire for 4 hours until they were relieved by the Army. At some point in this fight, Corporal Garland was struck by a Nez Perce bullet. It hit his cartridge belt, driving 2 cartridges into his body, smashing through his hip bone, rendering him unable to stand. He continued to direct the fire of his men with excellent judgment until relieved of duty. For this action and commendation received later at Muddy Creek, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. However, his wound did not heal properly, and unable to function as a combat soldier, he was assigned duty at Fort Ellis Post Hospital as a hospital steward. As you noticed on his headstone, it says that he was a hospital steward. A light duty position as ordered as an orderly or nurse to the sick and injured of Fort Ellis. Unable to endure the unending pain of his severe wound, hospital steward Garland died May 21st, 1883, of an overdose of morphine. He was buried at Fort Ellis Cemetery. Fort Ellis was abandoned in 1886. In January of 1887, the removal of 39 unclaimed bodies and their reinterment at Fort Missoula Cemetery was authorized. Hospital steward and Medal of Honor recipient Harry Garland was one of the 37 actual reinterments made here. He now rests under a new, as of spring 2006, headstone honoring a Medal of Honor recipient who knew who he was here at this time and everything about his story. Thank you.
Well, my topic is the influenza epidemic of 1918-1919, and it's a story about science and a kind of story of the state of the nation during World War I. About a little background on influenza. The key numbers you should keep in mind for influenza 1918-1919 is 25 million deaths worldwide, 675,000 deaths in the nation, and probably about 15 to 25 deaths here at Fort Missoula. We're not quite sure of the exact totals. People were kind of taken away and buried elsewhere before they were properly recorded. But the influenza epidemic got going in very early 1918 or late 1917. What happened was a thing called genetic drift, probably in China. Apparently some population didn't have some immunity that it did, and the disease kind of got rolling. The influenza got rolling and started moving throughout the globe. And it was a good opportune time for it to do so. The world was at war. World War I was underway. You had a lot of people, a lot of ships being moving back and forth between the various nations of the world, moving troops around, moving supplies, and so the transmission belts were pretty well prepared for the influenza to get going, much as the Black Death did during the medieval period. More people moving around, more people coming into contact with it and falling ill. So it hits first in Spain, in Europe, primarily Spain first. About 8 million deaths in Spain, incredibly, by itself. And then it works its way throughout Europe. And of course, Europe is engaged in the conflagration of World War I. There's all sorts of trench warfare, all sorts of conflict going on, and medical facilities are often not available or run down or not geared towards preventing infectious disease, and it sweeps across Europe, and eventually it makes its way to the U.S. in May of 1917. First big outbreak in the U.S. is an outbreak at an Army camp in Kansas. First fatality is there, patient 0 for the U.S., and it starts working its way throughout the various states as people start coming into contact with it. And so it is a rather traumatic hit for the nation to take, being while a war is underway. But as I'll explain shortly, the nation was also kind of prepared to an extent to deal with the influenza as well. So meantime, locally here at Fort Missoula, we have what's known as the Student Army Training Corps, the SATC, which is active at this time at Fort Missoula. Kind of a difficult period for us to interpret at Fort Missoula because they didn't really leave any major buildings or construction behind them during World War I. Instead, they utilized existing buildings throughout the fort to set up this. But this was a program administered by the University of Montana to increase the number of trained men for the Army. At this time, the U.S. Army was undergoing exponential expansion, just by thousands and thousands of men per day, for what was expected to be a 2 to 3 year grapple with the Germans on the Western Front. And so the university takes on the job of educating here at Fort Missoula, primarily auto mechanics and chauffeurs, people like Ole Beck who are interested in automobiles and want to get involved in the this emerging component of the armed forces. So about 3/4 of them are working in the automotive disciplines, and about 1/4 of them are working in blacksmithing, because the Army still has a lot of horses and mules. Nonetheless, there are a number of men stationed here at Fort Missoula under the SATC. And of course, you have a concentration of men, and perhaps not all the good sanitary practices you might expect from a large conglomeration of men suddenly put together, because at this time people are still getting used to the idea of infectious disease and taking preventive measures. This is still experimental in large part. And so the influenza epidemic hits here in October of 1917. And again, it hits at Fort Missoula, hits the civilian population in town as well. From about 150 infections, from what our records tell us, and again, probably about 15 to 25 deaths. And okay, some of these people were taken back and buried in their home communities. 2 were rather far away or didn't have sufficient local ties to be buried here in the post cemetery, along with some children who were hit by the influenza epidemic, and their graves are over in that section right here. You had a private right here, Private Gerard Corneliuson, and Private Norbert Gerondale right here. These were both privates attached to the SATC. Corneliuson was a bit older, about 28 years old, probably previous military experience, and originally from Holland, a Dutch immigrant. And his parents were settled in Highdale, Montana, probably one of those little homestead towns in the 1900s that nobody is there anymore, that kind of blew away during the 20s and the dirty 30s in Montana, the Dust Bowl years. So he dies on October 16th, 1917. He is followed by Private Gerondale, who is from Michigan originally, and he dies on October 16th, 1918. So 2 of the fatalities here at Fort Missoula, and they're buried here at the post cemetery. So, and again, this is a drama that's being replayed in thousands and thousands of locales throughout the U.S., both in the military and civilian communities. And again, the influenza epidemic hits everybody, hits all walks of life. Even President Wilson comes down with influenza for a time. So you can see, if this had happened perhaps 40, 50 years earlier, we might have reached definite levels of population decline in the U.S., because in the mid-19th century, the understanding of infectious disease was still rudimentary. By the turn of the century, however, more science was coming online, and people were starting to realize what you had to do to restrict infectious disease and so forth. So this is also, notably, this is what's known as the Progressive Era in American history. And there's so much out of the Progressive Era, which is basically the era from Theodore Roosevelt to the end of Woodrow Wilson's administration, where organization is key to American life. There's a great belief we can modernize the country, we can improve our standard of living, improve our governance if we study the problems, study them intensively with academic methods that we face, and then use our organizational skills to overcome them. And often organization in many terms means coercion. Simply, you're going to be told what's good for you, and what's good for you will be enforced upon you. So So there's a lot of interesting things going on. So much of American modern life dates from this era. The first big nonprofit organizations are formed during this era. There's increased use of science by the government to try to undertake various experimentation and understanding of American life. Just everybody is big on this kind of thing. It's the ideal is you're adopting a progressive approach. And so when it comes to infectious disease, there's a good deal of this organization that goes into meeting the threat. And again, the government undertakes a much more coercive attempt than it might have in previous years. The nation organizes to meet it. The Red Cross goes into action. There's quarantine of people who are infected. There's travel restrictions put on people. You're required to wear gauze masks in public. Police go around, and when they see groups of people gathering in groups of more than 10 or 20, they say, no, that's a disease risk. You have to disperse. And all these things are going on across the nation, including here in Missoula as well. And people are enlisted as in kind of a general civic effort to try to limit the spread of the disease. Lots of quarantine, lots of restriction on movement, and all these things are coordinated by what people think is a scientific manner. So in this way, gradually, the disease runs its course to begin with. It gets those whose resistance is weakened. Some people, there is a survival rate, significantly high survival rate of it for those who manage to come into contact with it. And again, these coercive measures prevent the disease from reaching certain components of society altogether, certain quadrants and certain geographic areas. And by the spring of 1919, the disease has run its course, both globally and in the U.S. The infections start tapering off, and again, those who can get well, get well. Those who are sick, terminally sick, die, and eventually the disease just burns itself out. By summer of 1919, the influenza epidemic is in the medical records, and it's not an active factor anymore. And that was really the nation's last experience with a wholesale infectious disease. We remember the SARS panic about bird flu some years ago in Asia. Some people speculate that we may run into that kind of thing again. There's really no way of telling where the next one of these will come from. But at least we have some reassurance that our medical capabilities are a bit better able to handle it, and so are our social organizational abilities. And again, that stems from the initial experiments in this kind of thing during the progressive era of 1900 to 1920, and of course encompassing the World War I years. So if you're interested in learning more about influenza, the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula has a full exhibit on the influenza epidemic, and if you'd like to know more about World War I, the Rocky Mountain Museum of Military History, also down the road, has a full room on both World War I and World War II together. So happy to take any questions on influenza, if you might have anything. Well, thank you very much.
Did they understand about things like hand washing?
Oh yes, yes. Public health officers became very obsessive about this, and so this gradually took hold that you had to do that. This was an era where my favorite anecdote of the 1900s is in Kansas, in the schools there, these little one-room schoolhouses all over the prairie. You had a single drinking cup and a dipper for everybody to use. And so one of the big public health obsessions of the 1900s in Kansas was getting kids individual drinking cups. And of course they ran into all sorts of resistance from people who said the one single cup was good enough for me when I was growing up, and why do we need to do all this fancy pants stuff? So it's that kind of thing you had to overcome. That was a big part of public health from the 1910s and the 1920s. So, yeah.
In World War I, what was the ratio of combat deaths to sickness?
For the U.S. suffers about 160 to 180,000 total military deaths during the war. Approximately one half of those are from influenza. The rest come from other disease and inaction.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Thank you for coming today to the Fort Missoula Post Cemetery. I have a short story to tell you today of two lives that were unfortunately cut short. In early 1918, Joseph Morgan, private, was posted to Fort Missoula, and he arrived here from Kansas. Along with him, he brought his 22-year-old wife, Helen Fisher Morgan, And I think that Helen was probably very pleased to come to Missoula because her mother and stepfather, George and Janet Dillon, had a small ranch out in the Cold Springs area of Missoula. Helen was pregnant with their first baby, so I think that probably coming to live with her mother and stepfather at that time in her life was very comforting. Later on in the year, Joseph Morgan was stationed in San Pedro, California. So he was not here in October when his son was born. However, he did get a furlough, and 10 days later he was able to get back to Missoula. The day after he arrived, his infant son died of the Spanish influenza. More sadness was to follow. 5 days later, Helen passed away also of the Spanish influenza. And I'm sure that combined with the weaknesses of giving birth probably didn't help either. So sadly, both of them are buried here because he was stationed here. I don't know a lot about what happened to Private Morgan. I was able to find that in 1920, 2 years later, he was out of the Army and living with his in-laws at their ranch over there in Cold Springs. But after 1920, I have no more information on him. However, one of the very interesting things about doing a story and presentations like this at a place like this is we come up with information. Now, I'm sure that the family members know what the baby's name was, but as you can see, he's just buried under infant Morgan. Well, Marcia Porter, who is the person who has put this all together every year, was able to find the baby's death certificate. So I can tell you that 88 years after he died, we now know that this is baby George Morgan, and he was named after his grandfather, George Dillon. So he has a name now. So mother and son are buried here, victims of the 1918 influenza epidemic. And if you'd like to know more about that, until December of this year, the Historical Museum in the big brick building over there at Fort Missoula has a wonderful influenza exhibit. It's quite detailed and will give you everything you'd like to know about the Spanish influenza.
Thank you,
So,
Kim. That was wonderful.
Thank you very much for coming out today. Thank you. The stones on there are actually, that is a very, very, very old Jewish tradition. When you visit graves of your relatives, ancestors, you take stones. It's symbolic of actually leaving a piece of Israel or, you know, the mother, the native country. It also represents the fact that you were here, you tended the grave site, and you were thinking of them.
The Fremont child, still born on November the 7th, 1886, we don't have a name and we don't have a gender, so the sex is unknown. The baby is important to our stones program in a minor extent because of who the father was, and in a major extent of who the parental grandparents were. The father, the father of the child, Francis Preston Fremont, was the second son of John C. Fremont and Jessie Benton Fremont. And his wife and mother of the child was Carolina Townsend Fremont. Now, Francis, the father, Francis P. Fremont, was born in Washington, D.C., and he was appointed to the U.S. Military Academy on July the 1st, 1872. He left, however, without graduating on September the 8th, 1874, and on September the 1st, 1879, he was appointed from civilian life to 2nd Lieutenant, 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment, and he came with his regiment at Fort Missoula, Montana Territory on and around about November 14th, 1879. And while here at Fort Missoula, he received a promotion to 1st Lieutenant on April the 20th, 1886. He and his wife and the companies of the 3rd Infantry left Fort Missoula on May the 26th, 1888, leaving behind this child. And although he rose to the rank of Major and served well in the Spanish-American War of 1898, his career ended in disgrace when he was dismissed from the Army by court-martial in 1909. His wife had already divorced him in 1906, and he's bankrupt by 1907. Now, the important people in this are really the grandparents, and the grandmother was Jessie Benton, and she was the daughter of very powerful, influential Senator Thomas Hart Benton from the state of Missouri. His 30-year, 1821 to 1851, in the Senate had a profound effect on the growth and development of the United States, especially in the Midwest and the West. She was a brilliant and accomplished woman in her own right, and she knew how to influence the lives of those around her, and she actively promoted her husband's career. So many of the good things in his career were due to help and her guidance. However, the errors and downturns of his career were entirely his own doing. At least that's the story I'm sticking to. And the grandfather, John Charles Fremont, 1813 to 1890, was an Army officer, explorer. He's the important man here, explorer and politician. He was born in Savannah, Georgia on January the 21st, 1813. He grew up and attended college in Charleston, South Carolina. He secured a patron in the Senator Poinsett of South Carolina. And in July of 1838, Poinsett arranged Fremont's appointment as 2nd Lieutenant in the Army's Topographical Corps. He was a member of an expedition sent to explore and map the plateau region between the Missouri and the Mississippi rivers. In 1842 is when he married Jessie Benton. And with Senator Benton's support, he was sent to explore the route of the Oregon Trail and the Wind River Range to aid immigration to Oregon. The year 1843 saw his party cross Wyoming, Idaho, Oregon, and then southeast to Nevada, west into Sacramento Valley of California, and part of Arizona and Utah. This journey made him a national hero, and he has been viewed by historians as a true explorer, a pathfinder, and a government map maker. However, in 1845, he became involved in extra-legal and legal activities to secure California from Mexico, and this resulted in him being arrested by General Stephen W. Kearny for mutiny, disobedience, and conduct prejudicial to military order. He was found guilty of the last two charges, but President Polk suspended his sentence, but he resigned from the Army. Then, the discovery of gold in his California estate made him rich. He served briefly as one of California's senators, and in 1856, his popularity and anti-slavery opinions won him the Republican Party's presidential nomination. He was soundly defeated by James Buchanan. And at the outbreak of the Civil War, he resumed his Army commission with the rank of Major General. He commanded the Department of the West from headquarters in St. Louis from July 1861 to November 1861. In subsequent command in Western Virginia in March of 1862, he was ineffectual against General Stonewall Jackson and General Richard Ewell. He again resigned the Army in June of 1862. He was dissuaded from seeking the nomination of president in 1864, however, and he managed to lose some of his California holdings and most of his fortune in bankruptcy of the Memphis-El Paso Railroad, of which he was president. From 1878 to 1883, he served as territorial governor of Arizona, and in early 1890 he was restored again to rank as Major General, now on the retired list. As territorial, he also, from 1878 and 1883, he served as territorial governor of Arizona. And early in 1890, he was restored as Major General on the retired list. I've just said this, I'm afraid. And his pension sustained him until his death on July the 13th, 1890, in New York City. He is really best known by his nickname, the Pathfinder, and his memoirs, Memories of My Life, I think would probably be very interesting with his checkered career, appeared in 1887. His name appears frequently on maps of the West. There are Fremont canyons, counties, islands, and peaks and lakes. And there's more about him in the Missoula Public Library. And one wonders, with the baby, had the baby lived, whether he turned out of his father, his grandmother, or his grandfather. Somewhat checkered career.
In January 1941, Lou Elliott, Missouri farm boy, enlisted in the Army. Without any basic training, 3 weeks later he was on a ship to the Philippines, a slow troop ship. And when he reached there, he was assigned to the Coast Artillery on Corregidor Island, which is the fortress in the mouth of Manila Bay, controlling the bay. At the end of November 41, there was a war alert, so he was transferred over to the Bataan Peninsula with some artillery and a searchlight battery. December 8th, 41, the Japanese bombed the Philippines, and just a couple of weeks later invaded. And the American and Filipino forces were totally overwhelmed by the whole operation. They had prepared fallback positions on Bataan Peninsula, which were supposed to be stocked up with ammunition and food. And the ammunition got there, but the food didn't get there. So the men who were defending the Bataan Peninsula wound up pretty hungry most of the time. Cavalry horses disappeared first, and the mules came next, and from then on it was anything they could get. Lou came by one group of his fellow soldiers that were cooking something, and they invited him to share in it, and he looked down in and saw a little monkey's paw that looked like a child's hand and declined to have any of that meal. Later, I think he probably would have. But
Beginner's luck.
a day or two before the surrender of Bataan, his commander took him back over to Corregidor Island, and he was assigned to one of the mortar batteries up on top. He was up there when the Japanese bombed and was badly wounded at that time. So he was in the hospital still a month later when Corregidor surrendered, and he was taken prisoner then. He was used first for work details on the island, and then was transferred through Manila up to Cabanatuan prisoner camp, which is up in the central plains of the Philippines, a very hot and dusty area. There were many of the prisoners there who died from malnutrition and other diseases. Most of them on Bataan had caught dengue fever and malaria, and suffered from beriberi, and dysentery was pretty prevalent. In October of 42, the Japanese took 1,500 of the healthiest prisoners from Cabanatuan down to Manila and put them on the first of one of the hell ships, as they were called. They were crammed into the hold, about 1,000 of them in one hold, maybe 40 feet by 80 feet diameter, or in dimensions. The ships were called hell ships because they were, as well as the conditions being very poor there, these were ships the Japanese used to transport prisoners from Malaysia and the Philippines up to Formosa or Manchuria or Japan to use as slave labor in mines and on the docks and in factories there. Lou was fortunate in being able to get on the deck and stay up on the deck most of the trip. He was up there when an American submarine attempted to torpedo the ship, which was not marked in any way. And fortunately for all the prisoners, the torpedoes went on both sides of the ship and they were not harmed. Later on, some of the Hell ships were torpedoed. Many of them were torpedoed again because they were not marked. And there were more American prisoners died as a result of the torpedoings than died on the Bataan death march, something on the order of 12,000 or so. The ship had been used for carrying horses the preceding trip and had never been cleaned up, so that added to the problems, as well as the holds were covered by the hatches, so the men could not get an awful lot of air. They had very little food and very little water was given to them. The only recourse when somebody had dysentery and diarrhea was to climb 3 flights of ladders up to the deck and use the side of the ship. And many of the men were not able to make it up there, and after a little of that, many of them didn't even bother, so the conditions were pretty terrible down in the hold. At least 9 men died on the trip there from malnutrition or diseases and that. The only bath he said they had was on the docks in Formosa when the Japanese turned a fire hose on them, cold water. The 8th of November, the ship docked at Busan, Korea, where they were given some winter clothing, not adequate, but at least better than the shorts that they were had been wearing in the Philippines. They were packed into trains and sent 2 days and 3 nights up to Mukden, Manchuria, where they were billeted in some old barracks there, sod roofs. The barracks had a small coal stove at each end, which the prisoners had to keep going, but it was totally inadequate. Their bedding consisted of a sack filled with straw on the wood floor, and they found that it helped if 2 guys bunked together because they could help keep each other warm. One of the big problems they had there was lice. They were just pervading the whole building. Some had been there before, I guess, and some they brought with them, but they just were not able to ever get rid of the lice. Again, they had a meager amount of food, but they were fortunate in that it included soybeans, which gave them some protein that the prisoners down in the Philippines did not get. The men had to walk 4.5 miles to this factory, which I believe was Mitsubishi Company, and they were put to work in the factory building it or setting it up at first, and they found they were mostly American machines there. The GIs did all they could to sabotage the setup by destroying the equipment or throwing tools into the wet concrete and hiding them there. The first winter, 300 men died in that camp, and they were not able to be buried until spring when the ground thawed and they could dig the graves for them. The summer of '43, there were 3 new barracks built, a hospital, a kitchen, and a bathhouse that were very close to the factory, which helped them a lot, so they did not have to walk 4.5 miles each way. Lou was assigned to work a lathe there and said he had a pretty decent Japanese boss who, after Lou learned little Japanese, talking with him, he found the Japanese boss just wanted to go home, and Lou agreed on that, so they agreed there. There was a theft of supplies at one point, and the Japanese punished the whole group because nobody would own up to it. They made them stand in ranks at attention from 6 in the morning till 6 at night for 2.5 days. And the only break a man could get during that period was to fall down. But if he did that, he knew that he'd get hit by a rifle butt on the back or the head. So it was a toss-up which was worth more. They felt there was a stool pigeon among the prisoners who had informed the Japanese of the theft and who kept them informed of contraband that the prisoners would come up with occasionally. In December 1944, there was the first B-29 raid on the factory and that area. An ammunition dump was hit and blew up, but unfortunately the barracks were not marked as POW barracks, so the B-29s hit them also, and 19 men were killed and quite a number were wounded. During the next spring and summer, conditions stayed about the same. Towards August of 45, they began feeling that the Japanese attitude was changing a little bit, and rumors were starting that maybe the war was coming to an end. But they did not know for sure until the 10th of August, when after another B-29 raid, they saw 4 red, white, and blue parachutes coming down with men on them, and later found that it was an OSS intelligence team of 4 officers, 3 Caucasians and 1 Nisei, who were coming in to arrange for the surrender to the camp there. They knew then that the war was over, but were told that they had to stay in camp because the Japanese army was still controlling the area. That only lasted a few days because the Russian army came in and occupied the area very soon and locked up all the Japanese. The one exception was a doctor who had been kind to the prisoners, and he was allowed to the freedom of the camp to take care of sick people and that. They could not evacuate the prisoners until transportation got set up. And there were some of the more invalid, the sick ones, who were evacuated by C-47 early, and General Wainwright, who was up in the area near there, was also flown out at that time. During this period, B-29s dropped food, supplies, and clothing to them, so they began to get back rehabilitated from that. Lou said he got a hold of a candy bar and ate that clear down, and that was a bad mistake because his mouth and gums, teeth were sore, and he never touched candy for 3 years after that. They had also dropped lots of GI coffee, and this was too much for the prisoners' systems, that they were just wired on that and walking like zombies to a great extent. It was a month later that they were put on train, went to the coast, and then by hospital ship to Okinawa, and flown to the Philippines, and then by ship back to the States for repatriation. They were processed at each place and medically checked over. One doctor said he felt that the men had aged at least 15 years in general. Lou went to Michigan, where his sister lived, for recuperative leave, and the next year, 46, re-enlisted in the Air Corps so that he would have medical facilities close for the rest of his career. He retired in 1961 as a master sergeant, returned to Michigan, where he was a postal carrier and a school bus driver for a number of years. He had married Glenda Frank in December 1946 and had 2 children, and they came to Missoula in 1982. His wife said that the family knew very few details about their imprisonment because he just didn't talk about it like most of the ex-prisoners. And the most she found out about it was when she began attending POW reunions with Lou and heard him talking with the other POWs there. He had physical problems the rest of his life. She said any time that he got a cold, he would come down with a very high fever. And he felt a lot of his problems were due to medical experimentations by Japanese personnel while they were in the camp. It was in Mukden that the notorious Japanese medical unit had been doing experiments on prisoners there. Lou died on the 28th of May of 2000.
In June of 1877, when Fort Missoula was being planned, the cemetery was also included. It was going to be 1 acre in size. As you can see, the access road divides the cemetery into 2 main sections. Section A to the right from the entrance, and Section B to the left from the entrance. There are also Section C below Section B and Section D below Section B. It is interesting that the bodies were buried randomly in this cemetery. You can see that alignment and spacing of the headstones is unequal too. There are 241 headstones in this cemetery. However, one of the stones is over an empty grave. The body of Private Edwin McCall was moved to Kansas City, Missouri in 1923. There are 11 graves that hold 2 occupants in them, usually a husband and wife. In one grave, which is grave C53, there is a set of stillborn twins. Another grave that is right where I'm showing, the last headstones in this row, is of 3 members of wealthy family, a husband and wife and adult daughter. Thus, the number of remains exceeds the number of headstones in this cemetery. We have a very sad total of 64 children buried here. Fort Missoula Cemetery is the oldest active cemetery in Missoula County. The first burials were made in 1878. The first person to be buried was Private William Garrick, that is buried in grave C1, and he died in 1878. The second person to be buried was Lieutenant Thomas Wallace, who is in grave D35. The first woman to be buried at this cemetery was Matilda Clinchy Taji, whose story you just heard, and she was buried in grave A9, and she was the fourth person to be buried in this cemetery. The last person to be buried in the cemetery was Lieutenant Colonel Robert Brown, who died in January of 2008 of this year. Some veterans from all different wars in which the United States was involved since the war with Mexico in 1846 are also buried here. One of the veterans is in grave B24, right in front of you here, and that grave marked U.S. soldier, and this veteran apparently died in 1860 and was moved from Fort Ellis to Fort Missoula. All the units that formed garrisons at Fort Missoula are also represented here, such as 2nd, 3rd, 4th Infantry, 6th, 7th, and 8th Infantry, 14th Infantry, 24th and 25th Infantry. Some headstones are from schools held here, such as Student Army Training Corps and Citizens Military Training Camps are also represented here. There are also some veterans from other units and service branches who asked to be buried here. There are also some members of civilian army personnel who were not claimed by their relatives. There are some members of all 5 branches of services that are represented here, such as Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, and also Coast Guard, starting from private and finishing with Lieutenant General. Burials in this cemetery are now restricted to retired military personnel and their dependents, and also active duty military personnel who died from any causes while on active duty. Thank you for your attention.
I assume from what you said that the cemetery is not at its capacity then. There is space left for these special categories of veterans.
Exactly. There is a space, you can see it right there. It's Fort Missoula Cemetery is considered to be the oldest active cemetery in Missoula County.
What is the status of the additional cemetery on the other side of the high school?
I'm sorry, I'm not aware of this.
So to be buried here, you have to be a veteran and suffer?
Not really. Right now, burials are restricted to retired military personnel and their dependents, wife, children, and so on, and also active duty military personnel who died from any causes while on active duty. So right now, you could be buried here if you are active duty military person or retired also.
An Iraqi casualty could not be buried here then?
I'm sorry?
A casualty from the Iraq War would not be buried here?
I think they could. I believe so. I believe they could be. Active duty.
Retired.
Retired and active duty. 2 categories that could be buried here.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it appears as if it is getting filled up.
Yes, but I guess there is still some space. So
You got a lot of room out there.
yes,
for the officers.
a lot
You got
of room.
one way over
That's
there
right.
In the corner.
Oh, look at all this.
Well, you can actually see from the map too, there's quite a few empty spaces.
There's still room. Luckily, we don't need to fill it up.